All right, today we're talking about Chapter 6, Human Energy Transfer During Exercise. Objectives, we're going to identify the body's three energy systems and explain their relative contributions to exercise intensity and duration. Describe the differences in blood lactate threshold between sedentary and aerobically trained individuals. Outline the time course for oxygen uptake during 10 minutes of moderate exercise. Draw a figure showing the relationship between oxygen uptake and exercise intensity during progressively increasing increments of exercise to maximum. Differentiate between the body's two types of muscle fibers. Explain the differences in the pattern of recovery oxygen uptake from moderate and exhaustive exercise, and include factors that account for the epoch from each exercise mode. Outline the optimal recovery procedures from steady state and non-steady state, from steady rate and non-steady rate exercises. Okay, so based on the energy systems, we're talking about three energy systems here, which, quite frankly, ATP system can be even split off of the intermediate energy. I mean, it's still intermediate, but it's actually different a little bit than the PCR, the phosphocreatine, because ATP system is like it's categorized as almost like a 1 rep max type of thing. It's up to 8 seconds, but it's like a vertical jump or a 1 rep max on the bench. PCR, phosphocreatine, is about 8 seconds to 12 seconds. Short-term energy, lactic acid, or the anaerobic system, glycolysis, those are all synonymous terms. And that's about 12 seconds to 2 to 3 minutes. And then long-term energy is the aerobic system, which is from 2 to 3 minutes onward. So ATP phosphocreatine system is used during short duration, high intensity activities, 100 meter sprint, thrusting a heavy weight upwards, like I said, 1 rep max, things like that. It's more of a 1 rep max if it's ATP, and then phosphocreatine could be about like a set of, figure what can you do in 12 seconds. So you may be able to do like a set of, 8 to 10, maybe 8 reps. The quantity of intramuscular phosphagens substantially influences the all-out energy for brief durations. Okay, so you have to have those intramuscular phosphagens, the amount of that you have intramuscularly influences this all-out energy that's available. Creatine kinase regulates this rate of phosphagen breakdown. The lactic acid system. Okay, this is during intense exercise. You have intramuscular stored glycogen, provides energy to phosphorylate ADP during glyconeolysis, forming lactate. So you have glycogen that becomes lactate by the end of this lactic acid system, by the end of what takes place, which is the breakdown of glucose. So what it does is the breaking down of that can phosphorylate ADP, so you have energy available. This constitutes about, it's still rapid energy transfer, and it's in an aerobic format, but it's about 12 seconds to 2 to 3 minutes, and its activities are more like 400 meter sprints, 100 meter swim, multi-sprint sports. Blood lactate accumulation. So aerobic activities produce cellular adaptations that increase rates of lactate removal, but only in exercise at higher intensities produces lactate accumulation. Okay, so if it's not a high intensity activity, it's not going to produce lactate accumulation. Blood lactate accumulates only when its disappearance does not match its production rate, and then that's a problem because that's usually when people cease participation, because tissue hypoxia takes place, and that's a lack of oxygen. Okay, this occurs at a higher percentage of so when blood lactate begins to increase exponentially, it occurs about 55% of the healthy untrained person's max capacity for aerobic metabolism, and then it occurs at a higher percentage for for endurance athletes, people who are trained. So that's what this talks about here. It basically says that blood lactate concentrations for trained and untrained subjects at different levels of exercise expressed as a percentage of max oxygen uptake. So the blood lake, what happens if you look at this, what you're seeing is that the blood lactate threshold for trained people their threshold is, it takes longer, okay, for them to reach their max oxygen uptake. So, and a lot of that has to do with the blood lactate concentration. Blood lactate concentration increases more readily, more quickly in people who are untrained. Lactate shuttling, lactate produced through the glyconeolysis in one cell may be shuttled to another cell to provide fuel for further oxidation. So skeletal muscle is not only a source of major lactate production, but it's also a primary tissue for lactate removal via oxidation. The liver also accepts muscle-generated lactate from the bloodstream and synthesizes the glucose. So it's using it as an energy source. The lactate is what's taking place. Aerobic system. The aerobic metabolic reactions provide for the greatest portion of energy transfer, particularly when exercise duration is greater than 2 to 3 minutes. Oxygen uptake during exercise. So oxygen uptake increases rapidly during the first few minutes of exercise and reaches a relative plateau between minutes 4 and 6, and then remains relatively stable throughout the remainder of exercise. Flat portion or plateau of the oxygen uptake curve represents the steady rate of aerobic metabolism. No net accumulation of blood lactate occurs under these steady rate metabolic conditions. It's because it's basically being removed. So oxygen deficit. Oxygen uptake remains considerably lower, below the steady rate level in the first few minutes of exercise, even though the exercise energy requirement remains essentially unchanged to the activity. And it's occurring because the first minute, you're still dealing with the ATP and phosphocreatine system providing the muscle's immediate energy requirement without the need for oxygen. Okay. And then the oxygen deficit quantitatively represents the difference between total oxygen consumed during exercise and the additional amount that would have been consumed had a steady rate aerobic metabolism occurred immediately after the initiation of exercise. So basically it's saying that the reason why it's below the steady rate is because in the first minute the ATP PCR system is being used, and that's what it's showing here, that in the first minute from rest, it's your uptake increases rapidly and then it levels off. This here shows that the oxygen deficit that muscle ATP and PCR depletion and muscle lactate concentration, basically they're plotted versus oxygen deficit. So the need for oxygen basically is shown at the top there, so that because initially what's happened is that there's an oxygen deficit in the beginning, and then the leveling off occurs because what's taking place is the oxygen is being utilized to remove the lactate. Okay. Is there anything else? So basically, a muscle's energy supply represents a smooth transition between anaerobic and aerobic sources with considerable overlap from one source of energy transfer to another. Trained and untrained individuals show similar values for steady rate oxygen uptake toward light and moderate exercise, and that's because they don't have to remove lactate, okay? Because it's light and moderate exercise. The trained person achieves the steady rate quicker, so has a smaller oxygen deficit for the same exercise duration compared with the untrained person. This indicates they consume more oxygen during exercise with proportionally smaller anaerobic energy transfer component because they've been more conditioned to this through training. And that's what this is showing right here. For trained and untrained people, both individuals reach the same steady rate VO2, but the trained person reaches the steady rate of VO2 more quickly than the untrained individual. Maximal oxygen uptake. The highest oxygen uptake achieved despite increases in exercise intensity. VO2 max indicates an individual's capacity to aerobically resynthesize ATP. So max oxygen uptake is the ability for the individual to aerobically resynthesize ATP to keep going. Okay, that's why someone's max up. So different people's VO2 max differs, and if they can't resynthesize ATP aerobically, then that means they don't have a very high VO2 max. There are individuals like Lance Armstrong and such who have a high VO2 max. They can resynthesize ATP aerobically in a very efficient manner. And that's what this shows here. The region. So as oxygen consumption goes up, as the hills of successively increased grade go up. So that's their VO2 max. The ability to still get, it goes to a certain level where they're still able to get ATP from oxygen. So they're able to basically still consume oxygen at the greatest amount of oxygen an individual can consume. Let me go back to that. So this is the greatest amount of oxygen at the top that they can consume and still generate ATP, which means they're still able to keep going. Some people that hit the wall that can't continue, it's because they've reached their VO2 max more quickly than others. Fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. It's on page 180. This talks about how they basically possess fast twitch. So fast twitch are either type 2 A or type 2X. And these possess rapid contraction speeds and high capacity for glycolytic anaerobic ATP production. These are used during change of pace, stop and go activities, increased forced output, or during all-out effort requiring rapid, powerful movements. And then there's slow twitch or type 1 muscle fibers that generate energy primarily aerobically, possess relatively slow contraction speeds, and are used during continuous activities. However, these are more efficient, the type 1, and they're generating energy aerobically, and so they are a more efficient muscle fiber type. However, if you're talking about quick burst activities, you're talking about the type 2. You're born with a percentage of these. However, they can be trained. You can't switch muscle fiber types, the percentage, let's say, that's in your body, but you can't change between types, like between 2 and 1. However, you can convert between 2X and 2A, in that if you start doing more aerobic activity, you are going to increase your type 2A, decrease your type 2X. If you start sprinting all the time, you're going to increase your the amount of type 2X and decrease your type 2A. Okay. It doesn't mean, though, that if you don't run, let's say you're doing distance all the time, that the diameter of your type 1 muscle fiber actually can increase. But they can't switch from like 1 to 2. Those can't go back and forth. Energy spectrum of exercise. The body's energy transfer systems can be viewed along a continuum of exercise bioenergetics. Intensity and duration determine the energy system and metabolic mixture that predominate exercise. And that makes sense. I mean, you know, if you're doing a sprint, you're using sprint up to 10 seconds, let's say it's up to 8 seconds. Around that time, you're using your, ATP, then phosphocreatine system. Okay, if you're doing something, a 400-meter run, and it's before 2 minutes, it's up to 2 minutes, you're using your glycolytic system. Okay, or your lactic acid system. It's the same thing. So the energy system, intensity and duration determine what energy system you're using now, and you obviously can train to those things. The aerobic system predominates low intensity exercise with fat serving as the primary fuel source. Liver increases the release of glucose to muscles as exercise progresses from low to high intensity, and it's advantageous because carbohydrate has energy transfer capacity 2 times more rapid when compared with fats and proteins. So we talked about this a little bit before, and pretty much what it is this is the whole bonking effect, where if you go past your 75% of VO2 max, it's around there, okay, because there's a difference between trained and untrained. Past about 75% VO2 max, it switches over to carbohydrates as the energy source that's being used. And it's good because it's giving you energy right away. That's why you see runners taking these glucose tabs and stuff like that. It's because it replenishes their muscle glycogen with glucose. If they lose that, bonking or hitting the wall takes place, and the intensity drops off markedly, so the quality of their performance declines. The reason, the factors involved with why this liver and muscle glycogen depletes after longer duration activity is based on the fact the central nervous system's use of blood glucose for energy, muscle glycogen's role as a primer in fat catabolism, and the slower rate of energy released from fat compared to carbohydrate oxidation. This just talks about the switch. So you obviously in the beginning there, you have the red, you have the percentage aerobic. It's being utilized a whole lot, okay, within the first so many seconds. And then the percent anaerobic is used a whole lot, the blue line, in the first so many seconds. And then it decreases. It says, so the max exercise time, as the time goes on, the system switches to an aerobic system. So in the beginning, you see it's percentage anaerobic, it's blue. It's at the top at 100% of total energy yield. And then it drops markedly, okay, very quickly. And then the other system takes over, which is the percent aerobic. If you see where it switches over, it looks to me like it's between 2 and 3 minutes, right? So it's switching over between the lactic acid, the lactic lactate system, or let's say the glycolytic system, the anaerobic system, and then it's switching over to the aerobic system. Oxygen debt or recovery oxygen uptake or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC, now defines excess oxygen uptake above resting level in recovery, which refers to the total oxygen consumption after exercise in excess of pre-exercise baseline level. This is just talking about how with oxygen debt, the return to baseline, there's different ways that the oxygen consumption returns to baseline, and a lot of it has to do with intensity of what you're doing. It takes longer to recover to baseline levels of oxygen uptake if you're having more high intensity activity, like high intensity distance run versus a low intensity steady state, let's say. And that's what this talks about here. It's on 184. Talks about how light aerobic exercise, you have your recovery VO2 is so your exercise VO2 is reached, it's at the top at steady state, and then and when you're finished, you have this fast component and slow component of the recovery VO2, but the recovery is pretty rapid. You have moderate to heavy aerobic exercise. You have the fast component. It takes longer to than the light aerobic, but the slow component is taking a lot longer too, so that you're returning to baseline in recovery VO2. And then if you go to the all-out maximal exercise, aerobic, anaerobic, you see that either one, you have that fast component and your slow component, okay? And you also see your energy requirement of exercise exceeds your VO2 max. So because of that, both of these, the fast and slow component, are taking a long time to basically get back to baseline levels. The different reasons for the causes of excess post-exercise oxygen consumption are resynthesis of ATP and phosphocreatine, resynthesis of blood lactate to glycogen, oxidation of blood lactate and energy metabolism, restoration of oxygen to blood, tissue fluids, and myoglobin, thermogenic effects of elevated core temperature, thermogenic effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine, and increased recovery pulmonary and circulatory dynamics. Okay, and that's really what we're talking about here. We're saying, why is it that that's taking place? Okay, why is EPOC taking place? Post-exercise oxygen consumption. Why is that taking place? Well, the ATP and PCR have to be resynthesized, okay, in the muscle, ATP. And the ability for phosphocreatine to be resynthesized so that you can have the ability to do work. Because obviously ATP is biological currency. Resynthesis of blood lactate to glycogen is so that the blood lactate that occurred, you want it to go back to glycogen so glycogen can be used in the muscles. And also glycogen is in the liver. Oxidation of blood lactate and energy metabolism, so it's clearing that, okay? That's one of the factors that affect this. Restoration of oxygen to blood, tissue fluids, myoglobin. Myoglobin is the red protein containing heme, which is iron that carries and stores oxygen in muscle cells. Thermogenic effects of elevated core temp. So after exercise, your core temp is up, and that's one of the things that has been noted, that core temperature can remain up for a period of time, so that because of that, that's one of the reasons why, a factor affecting this excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And the thermogenic effects of hormones, particularly catecholamines, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is like the adrenaline, and norepinephrine causes, and these are two neurotransmitters, and the norepinephrine causes focus and attention. And then you have increased pulmonary and circulatory dynamics and other elevated levels of physiological function. So these are the factors affecting this excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Okay. EPOC fundamentals. We have the fast component and low density, and low intensity primarily aerobic exercise. About half the total EPOC occurs within 30 seconds. Complete recovery requires several minutes. Okay, and this is in regards to low intensity exercise. The slow component, which is a second slower phase that occurs in recovery from more strenuous exercise. It depends on exercise intensity and duration and may require 24 hours or more before establishing the pre-exercise oxygen uptake. And that's what was going on in, let's go back here, in this oxygen debt figure on page 184, figure 6.9. It's showing on C that it's taking a longer time in recovery to get to back to those baseline levels. EPOC in recovery, lactate doesn't accumulate considerably. It doesn't accumulate considerably with steady rate aerobic exercise or 5 to 10 seconds bouts of all-out effort powered by intermuscular high-energy phosphates, because it's steady rate, okay, and it's 5 to 10 seconds. It's steady rate aerobic or 5 to 10 seconds. It's powered by the phosphates, okay, so that's why lactate's not accumulating. The recovery proceeds rapidly, enabling exercise to begin, and again with only a brief pause. The anaerobic exercise powered mainly by glycolysis causes lactate buildup, significantly disruption in physiological processes, internal environments, requires more time to complete recovery, active and passive. And that's because you're in a longer period of time that lactate is building up. Okay, you're talking that's why when fiber's 10-second bout, you're talking about the ATP phosphocreatine system being utilized. Okay, and that steady rate aerobic exercise, that's another example of something where the lactate's not building up. So when you go down to the anaerobic exercise powered mainly by glycolysis, you know, like we talked before, glycolysis is that lactate, you know, energy system. It's anaerobic. What's happening is with that is that is occurring between 12 seconds and about 2 to 3 minutes. So that's why that lactate is being built up, and that's why you need more time for the complete recovery. The active recovery is oftentimes, you know, it's called the cooling down, tapering off. Individual performs submaximal effort, large muscle groups, believing it continued physical activity prevents muscle cramps, stiffness, and facilitates lactate removal. Modifications of okay, and then passive recovery is the person's lying down, presuming that total inactivity reduces resting energy requirements and thus freeing oxygen to fuel recovery. Modifications of passive recovery include massage, cold showers, maintenance of specific body positions, and consuming cold liquids. Okay, and this is just talking about the different percentages of EPOC in recovery. If you're at 65%, okay, it takes you longer to get back to your resting baseline of lactate concentration. Passive, 35%, okay, and then 65 to 35%, okay. Optimal recovery for steady rate Exercise. Following occurs during recovery from steady rate exercise. Resynthesis of high energy phosphates, replenishment of oxygen in blood, replenishment of body fluids, replenishment of muscle myoglobin, and resupply of small energy costs to sustain elevated circulation and ventilation. Okay. All right. Optimal recovery from non-steady rate. Active aerobic exercise and recovery accelerates lactate removal. So now we're just talking about active, and we talked about the other. Optimal level of exercise and recovery ranges between 30 and 45% of VO2 max for bicycle exercise and 55 to 60 for treadmill running. Okay, and it just accelerates the lactate removal. Interval training. This is something. It's a small. There's a small snippet in the book about this. And not very large, but it talks about interval training, which this is like the HIIT training, high intensity interval training is exercising an intensity that normally proves exhausting within 3 to 5 minutes using pre-established spacing of exercise to rest intervals. The exerciser applies various work to rest intervals using supermax effort to overload specific systems of energy transfer. This is basically dealing with the intermittent type of exercise where you have supermax effort. So you'd have like an all-out movement up to 8 seconds duration. And then you have this, so it's like a spring on a treadmill and then jumping off, let's say, and you have this. So intramuscular high energy phosphates provide most of the energy with only minimal reliance on the glycolytic pathway, because let's face it, you're doing something up to, under 12 seconds, you're addressing the phosphocreatine system, okay? And then you have a rapid recovery, okay, then you do it again. One of the things that's been found with this is that actually you can cover more ground in a shorter period of time than, let's say, like steady state activity. Plus your lactate in regards to this has not accumulated as rapidly as steady state aerobic activity.